Good evening, my fellow night thinkers. Tonight, we're not chasing the stars. We're chasing the slippery shadows in our minds. You know those moments when you walk into a room and forget why you came, or when a memory hides behind a locked mental door, only to pop up at a yes, the frustrating, funny, and oddly human phenomenon of forgetting to remember. In the stillness of this night, we'll explore why our brains sometimes misplace the very things we need, and how to gently coax them back. Have you ever blanked on a name seconds after hearing it? Misplaced your keys in plain sight? Or completely forgotten a birthday you swore you'd remember? You're not broken, your brain is just playing a very ancient game. Tonight, we'll uncover why memory fails us, and how science says we can keep our most important moments from slipping through the cracks. Imagine, for a moment, that your mind is a library at midnight. The lights are dim, the air is still, and somewhere in the quiet shadows, a librarian is carefully placing books onto the shelves. These books are your memories, each one holding a piece of your life. But here's the trick in this library: the books aren't made of paper and ink. They are made of electric sparks, delicate chemical bonds, and shifting neural patterns. They are alive, in a sense. They breathe, they change, and sometimes they disappear. When you experience something, anything at all, your brain starts the process of making it into a memory. At first, it's just raw sensory information: light hitting your eyes, sound waves reaching your ears, textures pressing against your fingertips. These sensations are collected like tiny puzzle pieces, scattered across different regions of your brain. The visual cortex holds onto the images. The auditory cortex keeps the sounds. Your olfactory bulb clings to the smells. They are not yet a unified whole, not yet the memory you think of when you recall an event. Instead, they are fragments, stored separately, waiting for the hippocampus, that small, seahorse-shaped structure buried deep in your brain, to weave them together into something meaningful. But here's where it gets tricky. The process is fragile. If you imagine your hippocampus as a careful scribe writing in that midnight library, you can picture just how easily things can go wrong. Distractions, stress, lack of sleep, even a sudden interruption can cause the scribe's hand to slip. A word is written incorrectly. A page is left blank. A whole paragraph might be skipped entirely. In the real world, this means the event you experienced might never make it into long-term memory at all. You might live it, but never truly keep it. Scientists call this the difference between encoding and storage. Encoding is the moment your brain takes in information and tries to translate it into a form it can keep. Storage is when that information settles into the long-term archives, ready to be recalled later. But unlike a digital hard drive, your brain is not a perfect machine. It's closer to a painter working in watercolors. The pigments can run, the shapes can blur, and sometimes, the canvas is too damp to hold the image at all. In the early stages of memory formation, your brain is constantly deciding what's important enough to keep and what's safe to let fade away. The decision isn't always conscious, and it's not always accurate. You might remember the smell of popcorn from a movie night, but forget the movie itself. You might remember the sound of someone's laughter, but not their face. That's because your brain is selective, sometimes prioritizing emotionally charged or sensory-rich details over the neutral facts. This selectivity has evolutionary roots. Remembering the roar of a predator or the warmth of a campfire could once mean the difference between life and death, but it also means we lose countless little moments that seemed important at the time. Even when a memory does make it past the initial filtering stage, it remains vulnerable. In the hours after an experience, your brain works to consolidate it, moving it from short-term holding areas to deeper, more stable networks. This process happens largely during sleep, especially during deep slow-wave sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. If you miss that rest, if your sleep is fragmented or shallow, the librarian of your midnight library might never finish shelving that book. It sits on a cart in the corner, waiting until eventually the ink fades and the pages crumble. What makes this even more fascinating is that memories aren't fixed, static things. Once they are stored, they can be rewritten, edited, or even erased every time you recall them. Each time you bring up a memory, your brain opens the file, and in doing so, makes it malleable again. New details might sneak in, old ones might slip out. It's as though every time you take a book off the shelf, a gust of wind might blow through the library and rearrange the words. Over years, this means the stories you think you remember perfectly, your first day of school, your first kiss, the last conversation you had with someone you loved, might not be entirely accurate anymore. There is a poetic sadness to this fragility, but also a kind of beauty. We are not just the sum of precise, unchanging facts. We are the sum of living, breathing stories, shaped as much by who we are now as by who we were then. A memory of a childhood home might feel bigger or smaller depending on your age when you recall it. The voice of someone who's gone might grow warmer or fainter with time, depending on the emotions you attach to it. The act of remembering is not a simple replay, it's a fresh performance, with the brain as both the actor and the stage crew, recreating the scene from the cues it has left. To truly appreciate this delicate process, we have to look inside the biology of it. Memory formation depends on a complex dance between neurons, the nerve cells that communicate through electrical signals, and synapses, the tiny gaps where those signals leap across from one cell to another. When you have a new experience, neurons fire together in specific patterns, strengthening the synaptic connections between them. This strengthening is called long-term potentiation, and it's the neural equivalent of tying knots in a net. The more knots, the more likely the net is to hold its shape. But these knots are not permanent. Without reinforcement, without revisiting the memory or connecting it to other, stronger memories, the synapses can weaken. The net loosens, and what was once caught in can drift away. This is why repetition helps. This is why telling a story again and again makes it stick. But it's also why memories we never think about again can vanish almost entirely. Think of the thousands of faces you've passed in your life that you could never recall now. Think of the meals you've eaten that you could not describe in detail. Your brain didn't fail you, it simply decided those details were not worth the precious space in the library. Of course, this fragility also makes memory vulnerable to distortion. If the librarian writes down an event incorrectly, and you revisit that flawed record over and over, the error becomes part of the official history in your mind. This is how false memories form, not as intentional lies, but as honest reconstructions from imperfect materials. Studies have shown that people can be convinced they remember events that never happened at all, simply by being given repeated suggestions about them. The mind fills in the missing pieces with plausible details, and soon, the line between fact and fabrication disappears. In this way, our memories are less like photographs and more like paintings done in soft pastels. They can be smudged, blended, and altered, not only by time, but by the emotions, conversations, and beliefs we've picked up along the way. And yet, despite this fragility, they remain at the very core of who we are. They shape our identities, guide our decisions, and anchor us in the unfolding story of our lives. Every friendship, every fear, every hope you carry is bound up in this imperfect, shimmering system of fragile connections that you call memory. Picture yourself standing in the middle of a crowded street in New York City. Taxi horns blare, people rush past with coffee cups in hand. Billboards flash with advertisements. Somewhere nearby, a street musician is playing a saxophone, and the smell of roasted chestnuts drifts through the air. Your senses are drinking in 1,000 details at once. But here's the truth, your brain is not keeping them all. In fact, most of them will dissolve from your awareness before the day is over. Why? Because attention, not experience alone, is the true gateway to memory. Attention is like a spotlight in the dark theater of your mind. Whatever it shines on becomes sharp, vivid, and worthy of a place in your mental archives. Everything outside its beam fades into the shadows. You can think of it as the bouncer at the velvet rope of your hippocampus, the gatekeeper deciding what gets in and what is left out in the cold. When your attention is fractured, the bouncer is distracted, and important details can slip away without ever making it into the record. The act of forming a memory begins with encoding, and encoding depends heavily on where your attention rests in the moment of experience. If you are reading a book, but your mind is drifting to an argument you had earlier, Your brain is not truly recording the words on the page. If you are at a family dinner, but scrolling through your phone, the conversation might flow around you without leaving more than a faint impression. Your eyes may have seen, your ears may have heard, but without focused attention, the neural patterns needed for strong memory formation were never fully activated. This is one of the reasons modern life, especially in the United States, is so hazardous to memory. We live in a culture of multitasking. Phones vibrate in our pockets, emails demand immediate replies, notifications tug at us from every corner of our screens. But multitasking is an illusion. The brain does not truly process multiple complex tasks at the same time. Instead, it rapidly switches its attention between them, leaving each one only partially processed. These half-noticed moments rarely make it into long-term memory. They are like photographs taken with the shaky hand, blurry, incomplete, and easy to forget. Scientists studying attention have found that the brain's ability to focus is tied to the prefrontal cortex, the region behind your forehead that handles executive control. This part of the brain works like a director, deciding which sensory inputs get priority and how much mental energy to allocate to them. But the prefrontal cortex has limited resources. The more stimuli it must manage, the more thinly that attention is spread, and the less effectively any one thing is encoded into memory. This is why so many people experience what is sometimes called digital amnesia, the inability to remember information that was never given full, undivided attention. In the first place, even in quieter moments, the quality of your attention matters. A mind that is tired, stressed, or anxious finds it harder to focus. It's not simply a matter of willpower. Stress hormones like cortisol actually interfere with the hippocampus's ability to encode memories. Imagine trying to write in your midnight library while the floor is trembling beneath you. The words might come out shaky, incomplete. The same thing happens in the brain when attention is pulled toward worry or fear. One of the most fascinating aspects of attention is its selectivity. We are drawn more easily to certain kinds of stimuli: sudden movement, loud noises, bright colors, emotionally charged expressions. These are survival instincts, evolved over millennia, to keep us alert to danger and opportunity. But in the modern world, this instinct can be hijacked. Advertisers, app designers, and media producers craft their work to capture and hold your attention in short bursts, often at the expense of deeper engagement. This means we are constantly paying attention, but often to things that do not build lasting memories because they are not tied to meaningful, sustained focus. Think about the last time you met someone new. You shook hands, exchanged names, maybe even shared a laugh, and then, moments later, their name was gone. This is not because your brain failed you, but because your attention was divided. While they spoke, you might have been thinking about what you would say next, or noticing their clothing, or feeling self-conscious. The name, briefly illuminated by your mental spotlight, was quickly replaced by other thoughts before it could be fully encoded. Memory researchers often point to this as one of the simplest yet most common failures of attention. We can't remember what we never fully attended to in the first place. On the other hand, when your attention is fully engaged, memories can be formed with remarkable strength. Think of the moment you first learned to ride a bike without training wheels, or the instant you realized you were in love. These moments are often remembered in sharp detail because they demanded and held your complete focus. The wobble of the handlebars, the rush of wind, the sound of your heartbeat, every sense was enlisted, every neuron tuned to the experience. Such moments are encoded deeply because attention acted like a magnifying glass, concentrating the light of experience into a sharp, lasting image in the brain. Attention also acts as a kind of filter for emotional relevance. When something matters to you personally, you are far more likely to attend to it closely, and therefore to remember it later. This is why students tend to remember lessons that are connected to their own goals or interests, and why we remember conversations that touch on our personal values more than ones filled with neutral information. In this way, attention and emotion often work hand in hand, each reinforcing the other's influence on memory storage. the connection between attention and memory also explains why mindfulness practices can be so powerful. Mindfulness, the art of focusing on the present moment without judgment, trains the brain to sustain attention deliberately. By slowing down, noticing details, and resisting the pull of distraction, you create conditions in which your hippocampus can do its work more effectively. People who practice mindfulness often report not just better recall, but richer, more vivid memories, because they were truly present in the experiences they later recall. Neuroscientists have even identified a phenomenon known as attentional blink, a brief gap in attention that occurs when the brain is processing one stimulus and momentarily fails to register another that follows closely behind. This can happen in less than half a second, yet it can mean the difference between remembering and forgetting something entirely. It's a reminder that our attention is not an endless river, but more like a series of finite windows, opening and closing in rhythm with our perception. When you consider how much of our daily life is lived in partial awareness, it becomes clear why so many of our experiences slip through the cracks. A conversation half heard, a view half noticed, a thought half formed. These are like faint chalk marks on a sidewalk, easily washed away by the next passing rain. But when we give something our full, unbroken attention, we etch it more deeply into the pathways of our brain, making it far more likely to endure. Imagine for a moment that your brain is not a computer, not a camera, but a bustling newsroom. Stories are pouring in from every corner of your senses: sight, sound, taste, touch, smell. Some are dramatic, filled with urgent headlines and bold characters. Others are quiet, ordinary, the kind of small-town stories that never make the front page. In this newsroom, there's an editor-in-chief who has the impossible task of deciding which stories will be printed in the next edition and which will be tossed into the trash bin. That editor is your brain's prioritization system, and it works around the clock, silently deciding what's worth remembering and what can be allowed to fade into oblivion. Your brain is constantly bombarded with information. From the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep, every second is filled with sensory input: the light spilling through the blinds, the sound of a car passing outside, the faint creak of the floor beneath your feet. But if your brain tried to keep all of this, you would drown in detail. You would remember every blade of grass you passed on your way to work, every flicker of movement in your peripheral vision, every rustle of clothing. The sheer volume of data would overwhelm you. Instead, your mind evolved to filter. It chooses. It prioritizes. This selectivity is not random. Deep within the brain, structures like the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex work together to evaluate incoming information. The amygdala, often called the brain's emotional alarm system, assigns a kind of importance rating to each event. If something stirs strong emotion, fear, joy, excitement, love, it gets flagged. That flag tells the hippocampus, the brain's archivist, this one matters. Store it somewhere safe. That's why you might remember the exact details of the moment you got engaged, but not the details of brushing your teeth yesterday. Emotional weight tilts the scale. Survival instincts play a role here too. In the ancient world, remembering the location of water or the warning signs of a predator was far more valuable than remembering the pattern of clouds on a random day. Our brains are still shaped by those priorities, which is why we often remember things that are relevant to our needs, desires, and safety, while countless neutral moments slip away. Even in the modern world, we remember where we parked when we're late for work, but we might not remember the music that was playing in the background as we walked to the car. But the brain's prioritization system doesn't just look for danger or delight, it also hunts for meaning. Information that connects to what you already know or fits into your existing mental frameworks is easier to remember. This is known as schema theory in psychology. If you are a musician, you are more likely to remember details about a concert than someone who has never played an instrument, because your brain is attaching the new information to a rich network of related memories. The more connections a piece of information has, the more likely it is to be prioritized for storage. Attention plays a part in this prioritization as well, but even when your attention is fully engaged, the brain still weighs importance. Imagine being at a baseball game. You're watching the batter, fully focused. A fly lands on the railing in front of you, and you see it. But the moment is not emotionally charged, nor does it connect deeply with your personal goals. The sight of the fly will likely fade quickly, replaced by the more meaningful memory of the home run that came just moments later. Your brain made the judgment call without you even realizing it. Interestingly, this selectivity can lead to something called flashbulb memories, those vivid, snapshot-like recollections of significant events. For many Americans, moments like the moon landing, the Challenger explosion, or the events of September 11th are remembered in sharp detail. Where they were, what they were doing, who they were with. These memories feel indelible because the brain, sensing the emotional and social importance of the event, prioritize their storage with exceptional care. However, research shows that even these memories are not immune to distortion. We may feel certain they are accurate, but over time, details still shift. What remains constant is not the exact truth, but the sense of significance. This process of selective prioritization also explains why we can sometimes forget things we think we should remember. A student might study for hours, yet forget key points during an exam. If the brain did not register the studied information as important enough, perhaps because it lacked emotional engagement or personal relevance, it may not have been stored effectively, despite the time spent reviewing it. On the other hand, something a friend casually mentioned weeks ago might stick, simply because it triggered an emotional response or tied into a personal interest. In a way, your memory is like a museum with limited space. The curator cannot display every artifact, so they choose pieces that will draw the most attention, inspire the strongest emotions, or fit best with the existing exhibits. Some artifacts are placed in storage, accessible only with the right cues. Others are discarded entirely, and because the curator, your brain, makes these decisions automatically, you might never realize what's been lost. There is also an evolutionary elegance to forgetting. By letting go of trivial details, the brain preserves energy and makes room for new information. Memory is not designed to be a perfect archive. It is designed to serve the needs of a living organism navigating a complex world. In that sense, forgetting is not a flaw, but a feature. It is the brain's way of keeping the shelves clear for what truly matters. One of the most intriguing aspects of this process is that it can be influenced. You can train your brain to prioritize certain information by attaching meaning to it. If you link a piece of information to a strong emotion, a vivid mental image, or a personal goal, you increase the likelihood that your brain will keep it. This is why mnemonic devices, storytelling, and visualization are so effective in memory techniques. They are ways of tricking the editor into thinking, yes, this is worth putting in the next edition. In the absence of such signals, even important information can be lost. How many times have you walked into a room and forgotten why you came? In that brief journey from one place to another, your brain decided that the purpose of your visit was not worth keeping in the spotlight. By the time you arrive, the thought has already faded. This is called event boundary forgetting, and it happens because crossing into a new environment can signal to your brain that the previous context has ended, making it less likely to preserve the thought you were holding onto. The brain's selectivity also operates on a social level. We tend to remember faces, names, and interactions that are tied to our social bonds or status. In small tribal groups, remembering who could be trusted, who was related to whom, and who had wronged you was crucial for survival. Even today, our memory for social information can be remarkably strong compared to our memory for abstract data. You might forget the password to a website you use once a year, but remember the exact way a coworker looked at you during a tense meeting months ago. What this means is that memory is not simply a matter of storing everything you encounter, but of constantly making value judgments, often without your awareness. The brain is both archivist and critic, deciding which pieces of your life will be preserved and which will vanish. It is a system honed by evolution, influenced by emotion, guided by personal relevance, and shaped by the demands of living in a world that offers far more input than it can possibly hold. Picture a shoreline on a quiet, gray morning. The tide has gone out, leaving footprints in the damp sand. They are crisp at first, sharp in their edges, each toe and heel pressed clearly into the earth. But hour by hour, the wind stirs the grains, the waves creep in, and those prints grow softer. The shapes blur, the edges crumble. Eventually, the footprints vanish entirely, not with a sudden erasure, but with a slow, quiet fading. This is how the decay theory of forgetting imagines memory not as something ripped away in an instant, but as something that gently dissolves over time, its details slowly swept out to sea. In the simplest terms, decay theory says that memories weaken the longer they go unused. A memory is not a stone carving. It is an active pattern of electrical and chemical connections in the brain. Those connections, called synapses, are strengthened when a memory is formed, like tying knots in a fishing net. But if you never revisit that memory, never pull it from the shelf to look at it, the knots begin to loosen. Neurons that once fired together in a well-practiced sequence begin to drift apart, their signals less synchronized, their communication less certain. Eventually, the pattern breaks down, and what was once clear becomes vague, then inaccessible. It's an idea that fits well with what we experience in daily life. Think of a phone number you knew by heart in high school. You dialed it dozens, maybe hundreds of times, each repetition reinforcing the sequence of digits in your mind. But years later, without use, those numbers slip away. You might remember the first few digits, or have a faint sense of familiarity when you hear them, but the full memory is gone. The decay is gradual, imperceptible while it's happening, yet undeniable when you try to recall the information after too much time has passed. Decay theory also applies to skills and knowledge, not just facts. If you once played the piano but haven't touched the keys in years, your fingers may stumble over scales you once knew effortlessly. The muscle memory itself, a kind of neural memory, has weakened. The pathways in your brain that coordinate it, those precise movements, have lost some of their efficiency. They can be rebuilt with practice, but without that practice, the tide of time keeps pulling at the edges. The science behind this decay is tied to the nature of neural communication. Every memory is stored as a network of neurons linked by synapses. When you recall a memory, you are reactivating that network, sending electrical signals along the same paths they traveled when the memory was first formed. Each time you do this, you strengthen the connections, making the pathway more durable. But when you don't, those connections weaken. It's as though the brain is constantly pruning its garden, trimming back the pathways that are not being used to make room for new growth. There's an efficiency in this process. Your brain has finite resources, limited energy, limited storage space, limited capacity for maintaining active connections. To keep everything you have ever learned or experienced in perfect, vivid detail would require enormous amounts of energy, and most of it would be wasted on irrelevant information. The decay theory suggests that forgetting is not a flaw, but a kind of house cleaning, a way for the brain to stay lean and adaptable. By letting unused memories fade, the brain ensures that it is ready to store new, potentially more important information. Still, decay is not uniform. Some memories, especially those with strong emotional weight or deep personal meaning, resist fading for far longer. This is because emotional arousal triggers the release of neurotransmitters and hormones like norepinephrine and cortisol that enhance memory consolidation. If you vividly remember where you were during a major life event decades ago, it is because the emotional charge of that moment acted like a preservative, slowing the decay. Neutral information, however, has no such protection. It is far more vulnerable to the erosion of time. One of the most haunting aspects of decay, that you rarely notice it as it happens. A memory might feel intact simply because you haven't tried to recall it in a long time. Then, when you do reach for it, you discover it holds the name of a street you once lived on, the face of a classmate, the plot of a book you loved. Sometimes, the memory comes back with prompting, a scent or a song acting as a key to the fading image. Other times, it remains stubbornly out of reach, the neural pattern too broken to reassemble. Decay theory also suggests an explanation for why repetition is so effective in learning. When you study something repeatedly, you are essentially fighting decay by re-strengthening the neural connections before they have time to weaken significantly. This is why techniques like spaced repetition work so well. By recalling information at carefully timed intervals, you keep the pathways active, preventing the knots from loosening too much. It's like walking the same path through a field often enough that it stays visible, even as the grass grows around it. There is a certain melancholy in thinking about decay, especially when it touches personal memories. You may realize that you can no longer picture the exact handwriting of a loved one who has passed away, or recall the sound of their voice without the help of a recording. These details, once so clear, fade with time if they are not revisited. Yet there is also something gentle about the process. Decay spares us from the burden of holding on to everything. It allows the present to have more space, to be lived without constant interference from the past. Not all scientists agree that decay alone explains forgetting. Some argue that interference, the crowding of similar memories, plays a larger role. But even in these models, decay is acknowledged as a natural part of how the brain works. Neurons, like muscles, respond to use. Connections that are used often grow stronger, while those that lie dormant shrink. The difference is simply in how much weight you give to time itself versus competing memories. As the cause dot in the quiet metaphor of the shoreline, decay is inevitable. The tide will come in, the wind will blow, and the prints in the sand will fade. But there is a way to slow it. You can revisit the shoreline, walk the path again, make fresh prints in the same place. In the language of the brain, this means recalling, reflecting, retelling, and re-experiencing. The more you do this, the more resistant your memories become to the soft erosion of time. And yet, even with the best efforts, some fading is natural. The shoreline needs room for new footprints, just as your mind needs room for new moments. Imagine your memory as a vast library with endless shelves stacked high with books, journals, and handwritten notes. Each volume contains the details of your life, the people you've met, the places you've been, the lessons you've learned. But unlike the neat order of a real library, your brain's shelves aren't organized with perfect labels or tidy catalog cards. Instead, books are often placed where they seem to fit at the time, tucked next to others with similar covers or themes. And sometimes, when you return to find a particular story, you discover that other volumes have crept in, pressing against it, their pages spilling over. The words from one story blend into another, and suddenly, the memory you wanted is harder to find, harder to read, maybe even rewritten by the company it keeps. This is interference, the quiet, constant tug-of-war between memories. Interference happens when one memory makes it more difficult to retrieve another. It's not that the original memory is gone, but that the brain's filing system has allowed similar or competing information to overlap. When you try to recall one, the other slips into view, confusing the picture. Sometimes the interference comes from the past, older memories crowding in and blocking new ones. Other times, it comes from the present, fresh experiences overriding what was stored before. Psychologists call these two forms proactive interference and retroactive interference. In proactive interference, the past intrudes on the present. In retroactive interference, the present rewrites the past. Picture a phone number you learned years ago. For years, it was automatic, your fingers could dial it without thinking. Then the person changes their number, and you learn the new one. But in the early days, whenever you try to call, the old number still springs to mind first, slowing you down. That's proactive interference, where the old memory blocks the new. Now imagine the reverse. You've been using the new number for months, and one day someone asks if you remember the old one. You pause, frowning, because all you can think of is the new digits. That's retroactive interference, where the new has replaced the old in your mental spotlight. The root of interference lies in how our brains store related information. Memories that are similar in subject, context, or timing often share overlapping neural pathways. When you try to access one, the other may be activated as well. Think of it like having two songs with similar melodies stored in the same playlist. You press play on one, but the chorus from the other keeps slipping in. This is why students studying two similar topics back to back often confuse them. The overlap in detail makes the retrieval cues less distinct, and the brain struggles to separate them when needed. In everyday life, interference is everywhere. You meet someone who looks familiar but can't place where you know them from. Your brain offers up possibilities: a coworker from years ago, someone you met at a wedding, a neighbor from your childhood street. The correct answer might be among them, but the competing faces make it harder to feel certain. Or you recall a story a friend told you, only to later realize it wasn't them at all, but someone else entirely. The original memory wasn't lost. It was simply tangled in the threads of another, similar one. This blending can also happen on a larger scale, especially with events that follow similar patterns. Vacations taken to the same destination can merge in your mind until you forget which trip included which activity. Conversations with the same friend in the same coffee shop might fuse into a single, generalized memory. Over time, your mind constructs a composite, a patchwork quilt made of real moments, stitched together so tightly that the seams are no longer visible. There's a kind of efficiency to this. The brain, in merging similar experiences, creates generalized knowledge and overall understanding of what usually happens in a given situation. This is useful for making predictions and navigating daily life, but it comes at the cost of precision. The exact details of individual moments may be lost to interference, replaced by the broader pattern. The emotional weight of a memory can sometimes protect it from interference, but not always. A deeply felt moment may resist blending with others, standing out like a bright red book among gray ones. Yet even strong memories can be altered subtly by the presence of competing ones. The mind does not store each recollection in a glass case, untouched by time. Each retrieval is a reconstruction, and each reconstruction is vulnerable to borrowing details from other similar events. This is why eyewitness testimony, no matter how confident, can be unreliable. Over time, witnesses may unintentionally weave in information from other sources, conversations, media reports, their own assumptions until the original memory is no longer pure. Interference doesn't just affect what we recall, it also shapes what we forget. In a world where our attention is constantly pulled in multiple directions, new information comes at us relentlessly. Every new fact, every new conversation, every new experience has the potential to push older, similar ones deeper into the shadows. Sometimes this is helpful. You don't really need to remember the exact route you took to work on a Tuesday 2 years ago, so the new routes you take now can replace it. But other times, interference steals moments. We wish we could keep the exact words someone spoke, the sound of a particular laugh, the precise expression on a face. There's an irony here. The more active and full our lives, the more interference we face. A life rich with experiences is also a life where memories are constantly brushing up against each other, sometimes blurring at the edges. And because we often revisit our most important memories, we are also most likely to reshape them in the process, unintentionally adding in fragments from related moments. The act of remembering is never neutral, it is always, in some way, an act of editing. One of the best defenses against interference is to create distinctiveness. The more unique and vivid a memory is, the less likely it is to be confused with others. This is why novel experiences tend to stand out so clearly in our minds. The first time you travel to a new city, every sight and sound is fresh, and your brain assigns it a unique place on the shelf. But repeated visits can cause the details to merge unless you create intentional variations, visiting new neighborhoods, trying unfamiliar foods, making the experience stand apart from the previous ones. Another way to fight interference is through deliberate recall in spaced intervals. By bringing a memory into focus at different points in time, you strengthen its pathways and reinforce the specific cues that distinguish it from similar ones. Just as a well-worn path through a forest is easier to follow, a memory that has been revisited with care is easier to retrieve without stumbling into the wrong one. Yet even with these strategies, interference is part of the natural rhythm of memory. It reflects the interconnectedness of our mental lives. the way each moment is linked to others. In some cases, the blending of memories even creates something richer, a tapestry of overlapping moments that together tell a larger story than any single thread could. The price we pay is precision, but the reward is a kind of narrative coherence, a life story that feels whole, even if some of the individual details are blurred. Close your eyes for a moment and think about the memories that have stayed with you most vividly. Perhaps it's the exact smell of the kitchen on a holiday morning, the way the light fell on a loved one's face during a meaningful conversation, or the electric jolt of fear during a moment when everything changed in an instant. You can almost feel those moments in your body as if they've been etched into you. Emotions have a way of doing that, acting like ink that soaks deep into the paper of your mind. But emotions can also be tricksters. Just as they can burn a memory into place, they can just as easily cause it to fade, distort, or even vanish. The relationship between emotion and memory is not a straight line. Neuroscientists have long understood that the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure buried deep in the brain, plays a central role in processing emotion, especially fear and excitement. When something emotionally charged happens, the amygdala sends signals that influence the hippocampus, the brain's main hub for memory formation, telling it, in effect, this is important. Don't lose this one. This heightened signal can cause certain details to be stored with remarkable clarity. That's why people often remember exactly where they were and what they were doing during major, emotionally intense events, moments of national tragedy, sudden personal loss, or unexpected triumph. But here's where it gets tricky. The very same processes that make emotional memories stronger can also make them less accurate. High levels of stress hormones, like cortisol, can impair the hippocampus's ability to record information with precision. Imagine trying to write down a story while your hands are shaking. You might capture the main plot, but the fine details, the exact wording, the small visual cues might be lost or jumbled. And because the emotional center of the brain is in overdrive, those imperfect memories can feel just as vivid and real as perfectly accurate ones. In some cases, emotions act as a filter, allowing only certain aspects of an event to pass through into long-term memory. A person in the middle of a frightening situation might remember the sound of their own heartbeat, the flash of a bright light, or the sensation of running, but forget entirely what the weather was like or what song was playing in the background. Psychologists call this the weapon focus effect. In studies of eyewitness accounts, when a weapon is present, witnesses tend to remember the weapon's details vividly, but their recall of everything else suffers. The emotion narrows the spotlight of attention, making the rest fade into darkness. Forgetting can also be a protective function of emotion. When an event is too overwhelming, the brain sometimes steps in to shield us from its impact. This can take the form of partial memory loss, where certain fragments of an experience are missing, or in more extreme cases, complete amnesia for the event. This isn't always permanent. Some memories can resurface later, triggered by a smell, a sound, or a dream, but the fact that they can hide for years shows how emotion can not only strengthen memory, but also suppress it. And then there is the opposite phenomenon when low emotional engagement makes memories harder to store in the first place. The human brain is wired to notice and keep what matters, and to quietly discard what doesn't seem important. A mundane, repetitive day at work might leave you with very few distinct memories because nothing stood out enough to register deeply. Without the emotional highlighting that marks something as worth keeping, the brain treats it as background noise, fading it quickly to make room for other experiences. Interestingly, even positive emotions can cause us to misremember. Nostalgia, for instance, can act like a gentle brushstroke that paints over the rough edges of the past. We remember the good times more fondly than they actually were, trimming away the small annoyances or disappointments that were present in the moment. This kind of selective recall isn't always a flaw. It can make life feel richer and more pleasant in hindsight, but it also means that the past we carry is partly a creation of our present emotional state. One of the most fascinating aspects of emotional memory is that it doesn't always fade on the same timetable as neutral memory. A random fact you learned years ago might be gone completely, while a small, emotionally tinged moment like the warmth of a hug at a time you needed it most might still feel immediate and alive decades later. This persistence is linked to the way emotional arousal interacts with the brain's consolidation process. When you sleep after an emotional experience, the brain seems to devote more resources to stabilizing that memory, reactivating and replaying it so it settles deeper into long-term storage. That's why dreams can sometimes bring emotionally charged moments back to the surface, reinforcing them in ways you don't consciously control. But here's the paradox. While strong emotions help some memories last, they can also interfere with the orderly storage of others. Think of it like a flood of bright paint spilled onto a canvas. The intense color makes one area stand out, but it also blurs the surrounding lines. After a deeply emotional experience, the memories formed around it both before and after may be harder to access. This is why people who go through major life changes sometimes struggle to remember what happened just before the event. The emotional wave doesn't just mark the moment, it can wash away nearby details. Emotions also interact with memory through the stories we tell ourselves afterward. If an event had a strong emotional impact, we are more likely to revisit it in our minds, telling and retelling it to ourselves or to others. With each retelling, the memory becomes a little more shaped by the emotions we attach to it, sometimes at the cost of factual accuracy. The edges are sanded down, or new details, drawn from imagination, suggestion, or similar experiences are added in. Over time, the emotional truth of the memory might remain, but the factual truth might be altered. Culture plays a role here as well. In some societies, people are encouraged to openly express and dwell on emotional experiences, while in others, emotional restraint is valued. This cultural difference can influence how memories are encoded and retrieved. In a culture where emotional storytelling is common, the act of sharing can strengthen certain memories while subtly reshaping them. In a culture that downplays emotion, certain memories might fade faster simply because they are not revisited or reinforced in the same way. When we look at memory through the lens of emotion, we start to see that forgetting isn't always a flaw in the system, sometimes it's a feature. The ability to dim the intensity of certain memories can help us heal, move forward, and make room for new experiences. At the same time, the brain's bias toward remembering emotionally charged events ensures that we keep the lessons, the warnings, and the joys that shape who we are. Imagine walking into a room and feeling an urgent need to tell someone something, only to stand there in complete silence as your mind turns into an empty hallway. You know there was a thought, a sentence, a purpose, but it has slipped just beyond your reach. Or perhaps you've had the peculiar sensation of recognizing a face, but not a name, like the information is hiding just out of sight. These moments can feel frustrating or even worrying, but they are simply the everyday consequences of the fragile, intricate process the brain uses to retrieve a memory. Memory retrieval is not like pulling a book off a neatly labeled shelf. It's more like piecing together a scene from scattered puzzle pieces, some of which have faded edges, or have been misplaced entirely. When you try to remember something, the brain doesn't play back a perfect recording, it reconstructs the memory using stored fragments, sensory associations, emotional markers, and contextual clues. The hippocampus acts like the central librarian, guiding the search through countless interconnected pathways, while other parts of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, sensory cortices, and even the cerebellum light up to rebuild the experience. One of the main reasons retrieval fails is that the cue you're using to search isn't strong enough. In cognitive psychology, this is called the encoding specificity principle. You're more likely to remember something if the conditions during retrieval match those during encoding. Think of it like a secret code. The closer you get to the original combination, the more likely the memory will open. If you learned a fact while hearing a certain song, smelling fresh coffee, or feeling a particular emotion, recreating that environment later can help unlock the memory. Without the right cues, the brain might search in the wrong drawer, leaving you empty-handed. The tip of the tongue phenomenon is a perfect example of this. You know the information is there, you can even recall partial details, like the first letter of a name or the number of syllables, but the retrieval pathway is blocked. Neuroscientists believe this happens when the neural network storing the memory is activated incompletely, like only half the lights turning on in a room. You can see shapes, but not clearly enough to identify them. Sometimes, after you've stopped trying, the missing piece will pop into your mind minutes or hours later because your subconscious has been quietly running a background search, completing the pattern without your active attention. Interference is another culprit in failed retrieval. Our memories are constantly interacting, and sometimes new learning can overwrite or obscure old information. This is called retroactive interference. For example, if you change your phone number, your brain might start replacing the old digits with the new ones, making it harder to recall the original. The reverse is also true. Proactive interference happens when old information blocks new learning, like when you keep typing an outdated password instead of the updated one. These interferences are not signs of a failing memory system, but rather, the brain's attempt to remain efficient by prioritizing what it believes is most relevant in the present. Time also plays a role. The longer it has been since you last accessed a memory, the more the neural connections associated with it can weaken. This doesn't mean the memory is gone, it's more like a dusty path in a forest that hasn't been walked in years. Without reinforcement through recall or association, the trail becomes harder to find. However, even old memories can be retrieved if a song, a photograph, a scent acts as a powerful enough trigger to reactivate the network. This is why childhood memories can sometimes come flooding back unexpectedly after years of silence. The act of remembering itself can reshape what is remembered. Every time you retrieve a memory, your brain briefly makes it flexible again, open to change before it is restored, a process known as reconsolidation. This means that the memory you retrieve today is not an untouched original, but a slightly altered version of the last time you recalled it. Over decades, these small changes can make certain details fade, swap, or even merge with other memories. The mind is less a perfect archive and more a storyteller, constantly editing its own narrative. Emotions, as explored earlier, also influence retrieval. Strong emotions can create vivid recall, but they can just as easily cloud or distort the process. Stress, for instance, can make retrieval harder by flooding the brain with cortisol, which disrupts the coordinated activity between the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex. This is why someone might forget the lines of a speech when standing in front of an audience, despite knowing them perfectly in rehearsal. The information is still there, the retrieval mechanism is just jammed by the body's heightened state of alert. The brain also uses something called pattern completion during retrieval. Instead of searching for the exact full memory, begins with a partial cue and fills in the rest based on probability and past experience. Most of the time, this works beautifully. It's why you can recognize a familiar song after hearing only a few notes. But it's also why false memories can occur. If the brain fills in gaps with plausible details that fit the pattern but aren't actually correct, you might end up with a memory that feels real yet contains elements that never happened. Environmental context plays a subtle but important role. If you've ever walked back into your childhood home and suddenly remembered things you hadn't thought about in decades, you've experienced context-dependent retrieval. The physical setting acts as a backdrop that cues related memories. Conversely, trying to recall something learned in one setting while in a completely different one can make retrieval harder. Even if the memory itself is intact, forgetting, in this light, is often less about losing the memory and more about losing the pathway to it. The information might still exist somewhere in the brain, but without the right connections, it remains inaccessible. In some cases, retrieval failures can be overcome with the right strategies: mental imagery, verbal associations, even gentle repetition of related facts. In others, the memory might never fully return, not because it has vanished, but because the network that once supported it has been repurposed for something else. This fragile and reconstructive nature of retrieval is one of the reasons human memory is so fascinating and so frustrating. We live in a constant dance between remembering and forgetting, with each act of recall shaping the very thing we are trying to preserve. The brain, in all its complexity, is not a simple storage device, it is a living, shifting system that balances what it keeps, what it discards, and what it reshapes in service of who we are in the present moment. Picture yourself sitting at a desk with a book open in front of you. You read a paragraph, nod in understanding, then turn the page only to realize you have no idea what you just read. Or maybe you study for a presentation, feel confident the night before, but when the moment comes, your mind feels like an empty chalkboard. These are not failures of intelligence or signs of a flawed brain. They are simply reflections of how memory works and how it needs the right conditions to flourish. Improving memory is not about making the brain store everything like a hard drive. It's about creating pathways that are strong, clear, and ready to be used when you need them. One of the most powerful ways to strengthen memory is through repetition spaced out over time, a technique called spaced repetition. Instead of cramming information into a single study session, you revisit it at intervals, after a day, after a week, after a month. Each retrieval acts like walking down a trail through the forest, keeping it clear and easy to follow. Over time, the path becomes well-worn, and the memory more likely to appear when you call for it. This works because each recall reinforces the neural connections that store the information, making them harder to weaken through disuse. Another method is elaborative encoding, which means connecting new information to something you already know. The brain thrives on associations. It loves linking ideas together. If you meet someone named Rose, imagine them standing in a garden of roses. If you're trying to remember a historical date, link it to a personal event or a visual scene. These mental associations create multiple routes to the same memory, so if one path is blocked, another can lead you there. This is why stories are so memorable. They give context, emotion, and structure to facts, allowing them to stick more easily. Sleep is another critical factor in memory retention. While you sleep, especially during deep and REM stages, your brain replays and organizes the day's experiences, transferring them from short-term holding areas to long-term storage. Skimping on sleep disrupts this process, leaving memories scattered and fragile. Studies have shown that even a short nap can improve recall for newly learned material, as if the brain is using that downtime to file away fresh information. It's a reminder that rest is not a luxury for memory, but a requirement. Attention is the gateway to memory. If you don't focus on something when you first encounter it, your brain is less likely to store it. In our modern world of constant notifications, multitasking, and background noise, paying full attention has become rare. Practicing mindfulness, being fully present with whatever you're doing, can significantly improve encoding. Whether it's listening to someone's name at a meeting, reading a page in a book, or observing a scene, giving it your undivided attention makes it far more likely to be remembered later. Chunking information into meaningful groups can also help. The human brain is not great at remembering long, unbroken strings of information, but it handles small clusters much better. This is why phone numbers are broken into segments, and why acronyms can be so helpful. If you're trying to memorize a list, grouping the items into categories creates mental compartments, making retrieval more efficient. It's not about storing more information, but about organizing it in a way the brain prefers to find it. Physical health plays an often overlooked role in memory performance. The brain is an organ that depends on a steady supply of oxygen, nutrients, and blood flow to function well. Aerobic exercise, even something as simple as a brisk walk, has been shown to increase hippocampal volume and improve recall. Foods rich in omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and vitamins can also support brain health. Hydration matters too. Even mild dehydration can impair cognitive performance, making it harder to focus and store new information. Retrieval practice, actively recalling information without looking at notes, is one of the most effective strategies for long-term retention. Instead of passively reviewing material, you test yourself on it. This can be as simple as closing your eyes and describing what you just read, teaching the concept to someone else, or writing it down from memory. Each act of retrieval strengthens the connections, while also showing you what you don't yet know well enough. The effort required to pull the memory up is what makes it stick more firmly. Another approach is to engage multiple senses when learning. If you can see it, hear it, and even physically act it out, the brain has more channels for storage. This is why people remember song lyrics so easily. The combination of melody, rhythm, and emotion creates a multi-layered encoding. If you're learning a new concept, draw a diagram, speak it aloud, and write it by hand. Each of these actions adds a different thread to the web, holding the memory in place. Emotion is a powerful anchor for memory, so creating emotional connections to information can make it more memorable. This doesn't mean forcing a feeling, but rather finding the personal relevance in what you're learning. Ask yourself, why does this matter to me? How does it connect to my life, my goals, my experiences? The more personally meaningful something is, the more the brain will prioritize storing it. Reducing stress is another important factor. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, which can damage the hippocampus and interfere with both encoding and retrieval. Simple practices like deep breathing, meditation, gentle exercise, or even a quiet walk in nature can lower stress hormones and create a more favorable state for memory work. This is why a calm mind often remembers better than an anxious one. The brain is free to focus on the task instead of managing a perceived threat. Environmental cues can be used to your advantage. If you consistently study or practice recall in a certain place, the brain begins to associate that environment with the material, making it easier to remember when you're there. This is called context-dependent memory. Some people even use scents as cues, studying with a particular fragrance nearby, and then recalling the material when exposed to the same scent again. It's not magic, it's simply giving your brain another hook to grab the memory with. Visual imagery is another potent tool. Our minds are naturally drawn to images, shapes, and colors. Turning abstract ideas into vivid mental pictures makes them easier to retrieve later. If you're learning the order of planets, imagine them as characters in a story, each with exaggerated features and colors. The stranger and more unique the imagery, the more likely it is to stick. Finally, one of the simplest yet most neglected strategies is reviewing information before you need it. Many people only try to recall something when they are under pressure, during an exam, a meeting, or a conversation. But giving yourself low-stakes opportunities to revisit knowledge keeps it alive and ready. This could be as easy as going over key points while making coffee in the morning, or recalling yesterday's events before bed. Memory, like a muscle, grows stronger with gentle, consistent use rather than sudden, desperate effort. So, as we drift toward the quiet end of our journey tonight, we've wandered through the winding corridors of memory, from the fragile first moments when experiences are born in the mind, to the strange gaps where we lose them, to the small, deliberate habits that help keep them alive. We've seen that forgetting is not a flaw in the brain, but part of its natural rhythm, a way of clearing space, pruning the unnecessary, and focusing on what it thinks matters most. We've discovered that the mind is not a perfect archive, but a living, breathing storyteller, one that changes, edits, and sometimes even rewrites our past. And perhaps the most comforting truth is this: memory is not only about holding on, but also about letting go. In a world overflowing with details, our brains choose the moments, feelings, and ideas worth keeping, and those become the anchors of who we are. Every forgotten thing makes room for something new, a new lesson, a new connection, a new chapter. So, whether you're remembering something precious or letting a memory fade into the soft distance, know that your mind is always doing its quiet work, shaping your story in ways you can't always see. And maybe, the next time you forget something small, you'll smile and remember that it's simply your brain making space for the things that truly matter.